The sun was setting over the quiet suburban streets, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and parked cars. Officer Greg Hartley sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee from a stained thermos while scanning the area. He prided himself on being one of the most experienced officers in the department, though his reputation wasn't exactly spotless. Over the years, whispers about his behavior had circulated, especially among minority residents who claimed they were unfairly targeted by him. But Hartley brushed off those complaints as mere grumbling. To him, he was just doing his job. As he drove down Maple Street, something caught his eye: a black sedan speeding slightly above the limit. The driver seemed to be focused, but Hartley's instincts kicked in. He flipped on his sirens and pulled the car over. As he approached the vehicle, his boots thudding against the pavement, he noticed the driver, a black woman with striking features, dressed professionally and exuding an air of calm authority. Her nameplate read Maya Thompson. Hartley leaned down to peer through the window. "License and registration, please," he said curtly, his tone already tinged with suspicion. Maya handed over the documents without hesitation, her movements deliberate and composed. Hartley glanced at them briefly before launching into a lecture about safe driving. "You were going 5 miles over the speed limit," he stated firmly, even though there was no real urgency in his voice. Maya listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When he paused, she spoke up. "Officer, I understand your concern, but I'd like to point out that I've been driving carefully all evening. There's no dashcam footage showing otherwise, correct?" Her question threw Hartley off balance for a moment. He hadn't expected such a direct response. Most people either argued or apologized profusely, but Maya's demeanor was different: calm, confident, almost unnervingly so. Ignoring her comment, Hartley continued, asking intrusive questions about where she was coming from and why she was driving this particular route. Maya answered politely, though she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in his attitude. It wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. It felt personal. She'd seen this kind of behavior before: the thinly veiled skepticism, the unnecessary interrogation, and it made her blood boil. But instead of letting anger take over, she decided to play along. "Officer Hartley," she said finally, glancing at his badge, "I appreciate your diligence. However, I hope you'll agree that we both have better things to do than waste time here. If you check my record, you'll find I'm a law-abiding citizen." Then, with a small smile, she added, "And if you ever need advice on handling complaints, feel free to reach out. I happen to know a thing or two about oversight committees." Hartley smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Is that right?" he muttered under his breath, dismissing her words as empty bravado. What could someone like her possibly know about policing? Without another thought, he issued her a warning and sent her on her way, convinced he'd handled the situation perfectly. Little did he know, Maya's parting remark wasn't just idle chatter, it was a promise. And soon enough, Officer Hartley would learn exactly what that meant. After the traffic stop, Maya drove away with a mixture of emotions swirling inside her: frustration, determination, and a hint of amusement. She had encountered officers like Greg Hartley before, men who carried themselves with an air of authority, but often crossed the line into bias and arrogance. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been unfairly targeted because of their skin color or socioeconomic status. Maya knew she couldn't let this slide, not when she had the power to make a difference. As she pulled into her driveway, the weight of what had happened began to settle in. Maya stepped out of her car and walked into her home, where framed certificates and awards lined the walls, a testament to years of hard work and resilience. Her mind raced as she replayed the interaction with Hartley. His dismissive tone, his intrusive questions, and the way he seemed to scrutinize her every word. It all felt eerily familiar. But this time, things were going to be different. This time, she wasn't just another civilian caught in the crosshairs of someone else's prejudice. Maya sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began typing up a formal complaint against Officer Hartley. As she wrote, memories flooded back, memories of her own encounters with law enforcement that had shaped her career path. Years ago, during college, she'd been pulled over under similar circumstances. The officer had made assumptions about her based solely on her appearance, treating her more like a suspect than a student headed home from the library. That experience ignited a fire within her, fueling her desire to fight systemic injustice from the inside. Now, sitting in her role as the newly appointed head of internal affairs, Maya realized how far she'd come. It wasn't easy climbing the ranks in a system stacked against people who looked like her. She faced skepticism, resistance, and outright hostility along the way. Yet she persevered, earning degrees in criminal justice and building alliances with those who believed in reform. Her appointment shocked many in the department. Some welcomed her leadership, while others saw her as a threat to the status quo. But Maya didn't care about pleasing everyone. Her focus was clear: accountability. The next morning, Maya arrived at the Internal Affairs office early, ready to dive into Hartley's file. She requested dashcam footage from previous incidents involving him and reviewed complaints filed by citizens. What she found confirmed her suspicions. There was a pattern, a troubling one. In multiple cases, Hartley had stopped individuals from minority communities without sufficient cause, often escalating situations unnecessarily. Dashcam videos showed him speaking disrespectfully, making baseless accusations, and even fabricating details in his reports. Each piece of evidence added weight to her case. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes, Hartley went about his day as usual. He swaggered through the precinct, joking with colleagues and boasting about how he put another reckless driver in their place. To him, Maya was just another nameless face in the crowd, someone easily forgotten after a routine traffic stop. He never imagined that his actions, or rather, his carelessness, would lead to serious consequences. Back in her office, Maya leaned back in her chair, staring at the growing pile of evidence. A small smile played on her lips. For years, officers like Hartley had operated under the assumption that they were untouchable, shielded by their badges and the power they wielded. But Maya was determined to prove them wrong. This wasn't personal. It was about justice. And soon enough, Officer Greg Hartley would realize exactly who he had underestimated. Maya's journey to becoming the head of Internal Affairs wasn't a straightforward one. It was paved with challenges, setbacks, and moments that tested her resolve. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood, she grew up witnessing firsthand how systemic inequality affected people's lives. Her parents, both hardworking individuals, often reminded her of the importance of education and perseverance. They instilled in her the belief that no obstacle was insurmountable if she stayed focused on her goals. Her first brush with injustice came during her college years. One evening, while driving home from a late-night study session, Maya was pulled over by a police officer who accused her of swerving recklessly, despite the fact that she had been driving cautiously. The encounter left her shaken. The officer spoke to her disrespectfully, questioned her unnecessarily, and even implied that her car might be stolen because it looked too expensive for someone like her. Though she managed to leave without a ticket, the experience stayed with her, gnawing at her sense of fairness. Determined to understand the system better, Maya decided to pursue a degree in criminal justice. She wanted to learn how law enforcement worked, not just from the outside looking in, but from within its intricate framework. During her studies, she interned at various departments, observing officers' interactions with the public and attending community meetings where citizens voiced their concerns. These experiences deepened her understanding of the biases embedded in policing practices. She saw good officers striving to protect and serve, but she also noticed troubling patterns among others, officers who used their authority as a weapon rather than a tool for justice. After graduation, Maya joined the force herself, determined to make a difference from the inside. But climbing the ranks wasn't easy. As a black woman in a predominantly male-dominated field, she faced skepticism at every turn. Some colleagues doubted her abilities, dismissing her ideas as naive or overly idealistic. Others outright resented her presence, viewing her advocacy for reform as a threat to their way of life. Despite this, Maya refused to back down. She built alliances with like-minded individuals, proving her competence through hard work and dedication. Slowly but surely, she earned respect, and eventually promotions. Her breakthrough came when she spearheaded an initiative to improve community relations between law enforcement and marginalized groups. Using data-driven strategies, she organized workshops, fostered open dialogues, and implemented accountability measures that reduced tensions in volatile areas. Her efforts caught the attention of higher-ups, leading to her appointment as the head of internal affairs, a position few thought she'd ever achieve. But Maya's rise didn't come without sacrifices. Long hours at work meant less time for family gatherings and personal hobbies. Friends sometimes teased her about being married to her job, but they also admired her unwavering commitment. Even now, as she sat reviewing Greg Hartley's file, Maya reflected on the weight of responsibility resting on her shoulders. People looked to her not only as a leader but as a symbol of hope, a reminder that change was possible, no matter how entrenched the problem seemed. As Maya sifted through the evidence against Hartley, she couldn't help but think about how far she'd come since that night in college when an officer made her feel small and powerless. Back then, she had vowed to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Now here she was, holding the power to hold someone accountable for the very behavior she once endured. The irony wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about breaking cycles, challenging norms, and paving the way for a fairer future. With renewed determination, Maya leaned forward, ready to take the next step. Officer Greg Hartley may have underestimated her during their brief encounter, but he would soon realize that crossing paths with Maya Thompson was no ordinary event. The investigation into Officer Greg Hartley's conduct began quietly but methodically. Maya knew that building a solid case required precision, patience, and an unshakable focus on the facts. She didn't want anyone, especially Hartley, to suspect that she was personally involved until the timing was right. So she worked behind the scenes, pulling strings and gathering evidence with the meticulous care of someone who understood the stakes. Maya started by reviewing every complaint filed against Hartley over the past decade. What she found was alarming. There were numerous reports alleging discriminatory behavior, excessive force, and verbal abuse. Many of these complaints came from minority residents who described feeling targeted without cause. One man recounted how Hartley had stopped him for driving too slowly in his own neighborhood, a flimsy excuse if there ever was one. Another woman shared how Hartley questioned her repeatedly about why she owned a luxury car, implying it must have been purchased illegally. Each story painted a picture of an officer whose actions weren't just careless, they were calculated. Dashcam footage became Maya's most damning resource. She requested recordings from several incidents involving Hartley, poring over hours of video to identify patterns. In one clip, Hartley could be seen pulling over a young Latino driver for failing to signal, a minor infraction that escalated quickly when Hartley accused the driver of lying about his destination. The driver, visibly nervous, tried to explain himself, but Hartley cut him off, raising his voice and demanding compliance. It was clear from the footage that Hartley's tone shifted dramatically once he realized the driver couldn't afford to argue back. Another video showed Hartley approaching a black teenager walking home from school. Without any apparent reason, he ordered the boy to stop and submit to a search. The teen protested, saying he hadn't done anything wrong, but Hartley ignored him, rifling through his backpack before letting him go without explanation. Watching these clips made Maya's stomach churn. She knew this wasn't just poor judgment. It was systemic bias at work. Meanwhile, completely oblivious to the scrutiny he was under, Hartley continued his routine patrols with the same cocky swagger. He joked with his colleagues, complained about problematic neighborhoods, and brushed off any mention of accountability as nonsense. To him, internal affairs investigations were nothing more than bureaucratic headaches designed to waste time. He assumed this case would blow over like all the others, confident that no one would dare challenge someone with his seniority. But Maya wasn't just anyone. Every piece of evidence she uncovered added fuel to her resolve. She reached out to former complainants, asking them to share their experiences in detail. Some were hesitant at first, fearing retaliation or doubting whether speaking up would make a difference. But Maya reassured them, explaining that their voices mattered and that transparency was key to creating lasting change. Slowly, people began opening up, providing testimonies that corroborated what the dashcam footage already revealed. One particularly powerful account came from a junior officer named Marcus, who reluctantly admitted witnessing Hartley falsify a report to justify an unnecessary arrest. Marcus confessed that he'd stayed silent out of fear of rocking the boat, but after seeing Maya's dedication to fairness, he decided it was time to come forward. His testimony strengthened the case significantly, giving Maya the leverage she needed to push forward. As the days passed, Maya felt a mix of emotions: anger at the injustices she uncovered, determination to see justice served, and even a flicker of satisfaction, knowing that Hartley's days of unchecked power were numbered. Still, she remained focused. This wasn't about personal vendettas. It was about holding someone accountable for perpetuating harm within the community. And though Hartley had no idea yet, his arrogance was about to collide head-on with Maya's relentless pursuit of truth. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped into Officer Greg Hartley's mailbox at the precinct. It was a formal letter from Internal Affairs, requesting his presence for a disciplinary hearing regarding allegations of misconduct. Hartley skimmed the document with growing irritation, but shrugged it off almost immediately. He'd been through similar hearings before, minor grievances that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Probably some disgruntled civilian trying to stir up trouble, he muttered under his breath, crumpling the paper and tossing it onto his desk. On the day of the hearing, Hartley strolled into the conference room with an air of casual indifference. He wore his usual smirk, assuming this would be another routine meeting where he could charm or intimidate his way out of any accusations. The room was already filled with members of the Internal Affairs Board seated around a long table, their expressions unreadable. Hartley barely glanced at them as he took his seat, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. That's when he saw her. At the head of the table sat Maya Thompson, the same woman he pulled over weeks ago during what he thought was a forgettable traffic stop. For a split second, Hartley froze, his mind struggling to process the sight of her in this setting. She looked calm and composed, dressed professionally in a tailored blazer, her eyes sharp and steady. Then reality hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just some random driver. She was the head of Internal Affairs. And now she was leading the investigation into his conduct. Hartley's face flushed red, embarrassment quickly giving way to anger. "You've got to be kidding me," he said aloud, earning disapproving glances from the board members. Maya didn't react immediately. Instead, she opened a folder in front of her and began speaking in a measured tone. "Officer Hartley, thank you for joining us today. We're here to address multiple complaints filed against you concerning discriminatory practices and abuse of authority." Her voice carried authority, each word landing like a hammer blow. Hartley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his confidence wavering. He tried to interrupt, sputtering excuses about how these allegations were baseless, but Maya cut him off with a firm glance. "Let's review the evidence," she continued, gesturing toward a screen mounted on the wall. One by one, clips from dashcam footage played, showing Hartley's interactions with citizens. There was the Latino driver he had shouted at, the black teenager he unlawfully searched, and countless others whose lives he had disrupted without cause. Each video painted a damning portrait of an officer who operated less like a protector of the public and more like someone wielding power recklessly. Hartley squirmed in his seat, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of undeniable proof. Then came the testimonies. Former complainants recounted their experiences, their voices trembling with emotion as they described how Hartley made them feel powerless and humiliated. When Marcus, the junior officer, took the stand, Hartley's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might break. Marcus detailed how Hartley had falsified reports and pressured subordinates to stay silent. "I couldn't live with myself anymore," Marcus admitted, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. This isn't justice, it's corruption. Throughout the hearing, Maya remained composed, guiding the proceedings with precision. She occasionally locked eyes with Hartley, watching as his defenses unraveled. At one point, he attempted to lash out, accusing her of orchestrating the entire hearing as payback for their earlier encounter. "This is personal vendetta," he snapped, pointing a finger at her, but Maya simply smiled, a small, knowing smile, and replied, "Officer Hartley, if anything, this is about accountability. You've had years to correct your behavior. Today, we ensure you answer for it." By the end of the session, Hartley was visibly shaken. Gone was the swaggering officer who walked in convinced he was untouchable. In its place sat a man cornered by the very system he once believed protected him. As the board deliberated, Maya leaned back in her chair, letting the gravity of the moment settle. Justice wasn't always swift, but when it arrived, it left an indelible mark. The days following the hearing were a whirlwind for Officer Greg Hartley. Still reeling from the revelations and accusations hurled at him during the meeting, he scrambled to salvage his reputation. His first instinct was to rally support from his colleagues. Surely they would stand by him, wouldn't they? After all, many of them had shared similar attitudes toward certain problematic communities. But as Hartley reached out, he quickly realized that the tide was turning against him. At the precinct, whispers filled the hallways. Officers who once exchanged jokes with him now avoided eye contact or muttered excuses when he approached. Some even went so far as to distance themselves publicly, fearing association with someone under such intense scrutiny. A few veterans grumbled about how internal affairs was overstepping its bounds, but their complaints lacked conviction. Even those who might have sympathized with Hartley couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence stacked against him. Dashcam footage didn't lie, and testimony after testimony painted a picture too damning to defend. Hartley tried appealing to younger officers, hoping to find allies among those newer to the force. But instead of solidarity, he encountered fear, and worse, betrayal. One rookie officer nervously admitted to having witnessed one of Hartley's questionable stops months earlier. When pressed, the young man revealed that he had initially kept quiet because he feared retaliation. Now, however, with Maya Thompson leading the charge for reform, he felt emboldened to speak up. "I'm sorry," the officer stammered, avoiding Hartley's piercing glare. "But this isn't right." Isolated and desperate, Hartley turned to his closest friend on the force, Detective Carl Myers. They had worked together for years, and Hartley hoped Carl would vouch for his character. At first, Carl listened patiently, nodding along as Hartley ranted about how Maya was targeting him personally. But when Hartley accused her of orchestrating a witch hunt, Carl's expression hardened. "Greg," he said firmly, "you can't keep blaming everyone else for this. You've been playing fast and loose with your badge for years. Maybe it's time you faced the music." The words hit Hartley like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he found himself truly alone, without even his oldest ally willing to shield him. Anger bubbled inside him, boiling over into irrational accusations. He stormed into the break room one afternoon, loudly declaring that Maya was ruining the department with her agenda. Other officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing. No one wanted to be dragged into his self-destructive spiral. Meanwhile, Maya continued her work with quiet determination. She knew that while Hartley's downfall was inevitable, the real challenge lay in addressing the broader culture within the department. This wasn't just about one bad apple. It was about rooting out the rot that allowed people like Hartley to thrive unchecked. She held meetings with officers across ranks, listening to their concerns and encouraging open dialogue. Her approach was firm yet empathetic, emphasizing that change wasn't about punishment, it was about progress. As news of Hartley's impending disciplinary decision spread, reactions varied throughout the community. Some residents expressed relief, grateful that someone was finally being held accountable. Others remained skeptical, wondering if this was merely a symbolic gesture rather than genuine reform. Maya understood their doubts and used public forums to assure citizens that her efforts extended beyond individual cases. She promised transparency moving forward, inviting feedback and collaboration to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. Back at the precinct, Hartley's final plea came during a private meeting with the disciplinary board. Visibly agitated, he argued that his actions were justified, claiming he was simply doing what was necessary to maintain order. "You don't understand what it's like out there," he insisted, his voice tinged with desperation. But the board remained unmoved. The evidence spoke louder than any excuse he could offer. When the verdict was announced, termination of employment and permanent revocation of his badge, Hartley sat in stunned silence. The room felt suffocating, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. As he left the building, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions, he caught sight of Maya watching from a distance. Her gaze was unwavering, neither triumphant nor vindictive. It was the look of someone who had seen injustice and refused to let it stand. A reminder that accountability isn't personal, it's essential. The news of Officer Greg Hartley's termination spread like wildfire, igniting passionate conversations across the city. For some, it was a moment of celebration, a hard-fought victory against systemic bias and unchecked authority. For others, it was a bitter pill to swallow, with critics accusing Maya Thompson and Internal Affairs of overreach. Despite the mixed reactions, one thing was undeniable. The case had struck a nerve, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about law enforcement and accountability. Outside the police headquarters, reporters gathered in droves, eager for a statement from Maya. Cameras flashed as she stepped onto the podium, her presence commanding attention without needing to raise her voice. She began by acknowledging the gravity of the situation, choosing her words carefully. "Today isn't about one person," she said, her tone calm but resolute. "It's about holding ourselves accountable to the communities we swore to protect. Justice isn't selective. It applies to everyone equally." Her speech resonated deeply with many who had long felt marginalized by the system. Social media buzzed with hashtags supporting Maya's efforts, while community leaders praised her courage in taking on such a contentious issue. But not everyone agreed. Critics argued that Hartley's actions were exaggerated, dismissing his behavior as typical of any officer working in challenging environments. Some even accused Maya of using her position to settle personal scores, pointing to their earlier traffic stop as evidence of bias. Yet Maya remained unfazed, knowing that change often came with resistance. In the weeks that followed, Maya turned her focus inward, addressing the root causes that allowed officers like Hartley to operate unchecked for so long. She introduced sweeping reforms aimed at fostering transparency and rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the public. Mandatory bias training became standard for all officers, designed not just to check boxes but to spark meaningful reflection. Body cameras were distributed department-wide, ensuring every interaction could be reviewed objectively. Anonymous reporting channels were established, giving citizens a safe way to share concerns without fear of retaliation. Maya also prioritized mentorship programs, pairing seasoned officers with newer recruits to promote positive role modeling. She believed that lasting change required nurturing a culture of respect and integrity from the ground up. These initiatives weren't met without pushback. Some veteran officers grumbled about being micromanaged, while others questioned whether these measures would actually make a difference. But Maya stood firm, reminding everyone that progress rarely came easily. One particularly impactful reform was the creation of a civilian oversight committee. Comprised of diverse members representing various neighborhoods, the committee provided an external layer of accountability, reviewing cases and offering recommendations to Internal Affairs. This move was met with cautious optimism from the community, many of whom saw it as a step toward true partnership between law enforcement and the people they served. As the months passed, subtle shifts began to emerge within the department. Officers started engaging more openly with residents during community outreach events, listening to their concerns rather than brushing them aside. Complaints against misconduct dropped significantly, Though Maya knew there was still work to be done. Change didn't happen overnight, but each small victory fueled her determination to keep pushing forward. Late one evening, as Maya sat in her office reviewing progress reports, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The road ahead remained steep, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Holding Hartley accountable wasn't just about punishing one individual. It was about sending a message that no one was above the law. It was about proving that justice could prevail, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. She glanced out the window at the city skyline, its lights twinkling like stars against the night sky. Somewhere out there, lives had been touched by the decisions made within these walls. And though the fight for fairness was far from over, Maya knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, leading the charge for a better, more equitable future. Months after Greg Hartley's dismissal, the city began to feel different. The air seemed lighter, as though a long-standing weight had been lifted. Conversations that once centered on fear and mistrust of law enforcement slowly shifted toward hope and cautious optimism. Maya Thompson's reforms were starting to take root, and while no one expected miracles overnight, there was an undeniable sense of progress in the air. For Maya, the journey wasn't about resting on her laurels. Every morning, she arrived at the Internal Affairs office before sunrise, ready to tackle the next challenge. Her desk was always cluttered with reports, proposals, and letters from citizens, some praising her efforts, others expressing lingering doubts. She read each one carefully, understanding that rebuilding trust required listening as much as acting. It wasn't easy. Some days felt like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But Maya refused to let setbacks deter her. She knew that real change took time, patience, and unwavering commitment. One of the most visible signs of improvement came during community outreach events. Officers who once avoided such gatherings now actively participated, hosting workshops, answering questions, and even playing basketball with local kids at weekend tournaments. These interactions weren't perfect. There were still awkward moments and tough conversations, but they marked a turning point. Residents began seeing officers not just as authority figures, but as human beings capable of growth and empathy. For many, this shift was transformative. Maya also made it a priority to celebrate small victories along the way. When junior officer Marcus received recognition for his bravery in coming forward about Hartley's misconduct, she personally handed him an award during a department ceremony. "Courage isn't about never being afraid," she told the audience. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." Her words resonated deeply, inspiring others to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. But challenges persisted. Not all officers embraced the new initiatives, and some resisted quietly, dragging their feet on implementing reforms or grumbling about unnecessary bureaucracy. Maya addressed these issues head-on, holding mandatory meetings to discuss the importance of accountability and reminding everyone why these changes mattered. She didn't shy away from difficult conversations, knowing that true progress required addressing resistance directly. Outside the department, the Civilian Oversight Committee became a cornerstone of transparency. Its members worked tirelessly, reviewing cases, attending town halls, and advocating for marginalized voices. Their presence reassured the public that someone was watching, not to punish indiscriminately, but to ensure fairness. Over time, more residents began participating in these forums, sharing their stories, and offering suggestions for further improvements. It was messy, imperfect, and sometimes frustrating, but it was democracy in action. As the months turned into a year, Maya stood on the rooftop of the precinct building one evening, gazing out at the city below. The lights twinkled like fireflies, a reminder of how interconnected everything and everyone was. She thought about all the lives touched by her work. The young boy who no longer flinched when he saw a police car, the elderly woman who finally felt safe walking home at night, the rookie officer inspired to serve with integrity rather than indifference. In that moment, Maya allowed herself a quiet smile. She knew the fight was far from over. There would always be new hurdles, new biases to confront, and new systems to dismantle. But she also knew something else. She had sparked a movement. One person could make a difference, not because they were extraordinary, but because they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from her parents congratulating her on another milestone. She chuckled softly, thinking about how far she'd come since those late-night study sessions in college. Back then, she dreamed of making a dent in the system. Now she realized she'd done far more than that. She had ignited a flame, one that would continue burning long after she moved on. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant hum of the city. Maya took a deep breath, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight she let herself savor the victory. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And Maya Thompson was ready to keep walking, one step at a time.